The morning sun filtered through the thin curtains, casting golden rays over the quiet house. Elena stretched beneath the covers, savoring the rare silence of a weekend morning. No rush, no immediate responsibilities, just a slow, peaceful start to the day. Her husband, Mark, had already left for work, and her stepson, Alex, was at a friend's house for the day. That left Elena with a few blissful hours to herself. She planned to catch up on emails, maybe do a little cleaning, and finally start that book she had been meaning to read. A quiet, uneventful morning. That was all she expected. But life has a way of shifting in ways you never see coming. Around noon, Elena found herself in the kitchen, humming softly as she chopped vegetables for lunch. The rhythmic sound of the knife against the cutting board was oddly soothing. Then, just as she reached for the salt, a sound made her pause. The front door creaked open. Her brow furrowed. She wasn't expecting anyone. Alex wasn't due home for hours, and Mark had told her he'd be working late. A moment later, a familiar figure stepped into the house. Jake, Mark's 19-year-old nephew, who had been staying with them for a few weeks while figuring out his next steps in life. Elena exhaled, relaxing slightly. Jake was a quiet, polite young man. A little reserved, but always respectful. "Hey, Jake," she called out casually, wiping her hands on a towel. "Didn't think you'd be back so soon." Jake lingered in the doorway for a second too long. His expression was unreadable, his usual easygoing demeanor replaced with something different. Office Elena's fingers tightened slightly around the towel. "Everything okay?" she asked. Jake blinked, as if snapping out of a daze. "Yeah," he answered, his tone almost too casual. Then, after a brief hesitation, he asked, "Why are you wearing that?" Elena frowned. She glanced down at herself. Just a simple tank top and shorts, her usual around-the-house outfit. Nothing unusual. "What do you mean?" she asked, forcing a light laugh. Jake's gaze lingered for a beat too long before he looked away. "Nothing," he muttered. But it wasn't nothing. A subtle tension settled in the air, something almost imperceptible, but impossible to ignore. Elena turned back to the counter, pretending to resume chopping vegetables, but her focus had shifted. She could hear Jake behind her, his movements unhurried, measured. He wasn't leaving. Her instincts pricked. Something wasn't right. Taking a steadying breath, she kept her tone light but firm. "Did you need something, Jake?" A pause. "I'm just thinking," he finally replied, his voice lower now. Elena turned slightly, finding him standing in the doorway, arms crossed. There was a strange intensity in his posture, calculated, almost unreadable. She kept her expression calm. "Thinking about what?" Jake shrugged, his lips twitching in a way that wasn't quite a smile. "A lot of things. Life, mostly." His words were casual. His tone wasn't. Elena nodded slowly, trying to ignore the unease twisting in her gut. "Well, if you ever want to talk, you know I'm here, right?" For a moment, Jake just stared at her. Then his lips parted slightly as if he was about to say something important, before he stopped himself. "Yeah?" he finally said. "I know." Then, just as suddenly as he had arrived, he turned and left the room. Elena stood still, her heart pounding a little too fast for comfort. She told herself it was just a strange moment, a passing mood. Teenagers could be unpredictable after all. And yet, something about the way Jake had looked at her, something in his eyes, left a shadow in her mind. A shadow she couldn't shake. The afternoon drifted by in a strange haze. Elena went about her usual routine, answering emails, folding laundry, tidying up the living room. The house was quiet, but not in the peaceful way it had been earlier. Now, the silence felt heavier, as if something unseen lurked just beneath it. No matter how much she tried to shake it off, that moment with Jake replayed in her mind. The way he had stood in the doorway, the way he had looked at her, not quite staring, but not quite looking away either. And that question, "Why are you wearing that?" It wasn't what he had said. It was the way he had said it. Elena sighed, rubbing her temple. She was overthinking it. Had to be. She moved to the kitchen, determined to distract herself. Dinner would help. Something warm, comforting, maybe pasta. She had just started boiling water when she heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from the hallway. She turned her head just in time to see Jake standing there again. She inhaled sharply, startled. "Jake," she said, pressing a hand to her chest. "You scared me." He didn't react to that, didn't even apologize. He just tilted his head slightly, watching her. Elena felt her pulse quicken. Something was wrong. She forced a small, easygoing smile. "Did you need something?" Jake's lips parted slightly, as if he wanted to speak, but he hesitated. His gaze flicked to the boiling water on the stove, then back to her. Then, too casually, he asked, "Do you ever think about how fast things can change?" Elena's stomach tightened. She turned the heat down on the stove, keeping her movements slow, measured. "What do you mean?" Jake shrugged. "I mean, 1 minute things are normal, and the next, they're not." His voice was calm. Too calm. Elena swallowed. The kitchen suddenly felt smaller, the space between them suffocating. She forced a laugh. "I guess that's just life, right? Full of surprises." Jake nodded, but there was something unreadable in his eyes. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then finally, Jake exhaled and straightened his posture. "I'm gonna go for a walk," he said, his voice suddenly lighter. Elena nodded quickly, forcing herself to relax. "That sounds like a good idea." Jake didn't say anything else. He just turned and walked out the front door. Elena stood there for a long moment, her hands gripping the counter. She told herself she was just being paranoid, that she was reading too much into things. And yet, deep down, she knew. This wasn't nothing. Something was off. And whatever it wasn't over. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows through the living room windows. Elena had spent the last hour trying to shake the strange tension from earlier, but it clung to her like a second skin. She checked the time. Jake had been gone for over an hour. She told herself she wasn't worried. He was an adult, barely, but still, and taking a walk wasn't unusual. Maybe he needed fresh air. Maybe he needed time to think. Maybe she did too. Elena turned off the television she hadn't been watching and went to the kitchen, absently reaching for a glass of water. As she took a sip, she froze. The front door had just clicked shut. She turned her head, listening. Soft footsteps padded across the floor. Jake was back. Elena wiped her hands on a dish towel and stepped toward the hallway. She found him near the stairs, standing in the dim light. His clothes were slightly damp, like he'd been out in the misty air. "You were gone a while," she said, keeping her tone casual. Jake glanced up at her, then shrugged. "Needed to clear my head." Elena nodded slowly. "Did it help?" For a second, he didn't answer. Then, almost too softly, he muttered, "Not really." The way he said it sent a ripple of unease through her chest. She considered asking him what was wrong, pushing for answers. But something about his posture, the way his shoulders tensed, made her hesitate. Not yet. Instead, she forced a small smile. "Well, if you ever want to talk, you know I'm here." Jake studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then his lips twitched. Not quite a smile, not quite anything at all. "Yeah," he said. "I know." Then he turned and walked up the stairs. Elena exhaled, rubbing her arms as she stood there. The house felt different now. Quieter, but not in a comforting way. She tried to brush it off, but something lingered in the air, pressing down on her like an invisible weight. Jake had always been a little distant, a little quiet, but this was different. And she couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. Something she wouldn't be ready for. Elena lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The house was silent except for the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. She had tried to sleep, tried for the past hour, but every time she closed her eyes, her thoughts circled back to Jake. There was something about him tonight. Something unsettling. Her instincts whispered that she should be worried, but she kept dismissing it, convincing herself that she was overreacting, until she heard it. A soft creak. Her breath hitched. It had come from outside her bedroom door. Elena sat up slightly, her pulse quickening. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just the house settling. Then it happened again. A footstep. Slow. Deliberate. Right outside her door. Her throat tightened. She reached for her phone, but her fingers trembled slightly as she unlocked the screen. Should she call Mark? Or was she being ridiculous? For a long moment, she just sat there, frozen, listening. Silence. Had she imagined it? Taking a deep breath, she swung her legs over the side of the bed, her bare feet touching the cool floor. She moved carefully, listening for any other sounds, but there was nothing now. Just silence. She reached for the door handle, hesitating. Then, slowly, she turned it and peeked into the hallway. Empty. She exhaled, feeling a bit foolish. Of course, it was nothing. She was letting paranoia get the best of her. Shaking her head at herself, she turned back toward her bed. And then she saw it. A shadow. Just at the edge of her vision. Standing at the end of the hallway. Her breath caught in her throat. Jake. He was just standing there, watching. Elena's fingers clenched around the doorframe. Jake? She whispered. He didn't move. Didn't answer. For a long, unbearable moment, they just stared at each other in the dim light. Then, finally, he blinked. His head tilted slightly, as if he were considering something. You can't sleep either? He finally asked, his voice quiet. Elena swallowed. No, I guess not. Jake nodded, his expression unreadable. Me neither. The silence stretched between them again. Then, without another word, he turned and disappeared into his room. Elena stood there for a long time, her heart pounding. That wasn't normal. That wasn't nothing. She slowly closed her door, locking it this time. And as she lay back down, forcing herself to breathe evenly, one thought kept circling in her mind. Something is very, very wrong. The next morning, Elena moved through the house like she was walking on eggshells. The encounter with Jake last night still lingered in her mind, a weight pressing against her chest. She tried to convince herself it was just a weird moment. Maybe he had trouble sleeping. Maybe he was lost in thought. But no matter how much she rationalized it, she couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper was going on. She was pouring herself a cup of coffee when she heard footsteps approaching from the hallway. Jake. He walked into the kitchen looking tired. His dark hair was slightly disheveled, his expression unreadable. Elena forced herself to act normal. Morning, she said, keeping her tone light. Jake looked at her for a second before nodding. Morning. He moved to the fridge, grabbing a bottle of water. Elena hesitated, watching him carefully. Now was her chance. She set down her coffee and leaned against the counter. Hey, Jake. About last night. His hand froze on the cap of the water bottle. For a brief second, his entire body tensed before he relaxed again, twisting the cap open. What about it? Elena studied him. She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. I woke up and saw you in the hallway. It startled me, that's all. Jake took a sip of water, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed. Then he looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite place. Did it scare you? He asked. Elena's fingers curled slightly against the counter. The way he said it. Not apologetic, not concerned. Just curious. She forced a small smile. No, of course not. Just unexpected. Jake nodded slowly, as if considering her words. I wasn't trying to scare you, he said, but something in his tone made it hard to believe. Elena wanted to press further, to ask why he had been standing there in the dark, just watching, but she stopped herself. Something told her she didn't want to know the answer. Instead, she grabbed her coffee cup, taking a casual sip. So, what's your plan for the day? Jake shrugged. Dunno. Might just stay in. She nodded, but inside, her unease deepened. If Jake was planning to stay home all day, that meant more strange encounters, more tension, more unanswered questions. She forced herself to smile again, turning back to the sink to wash her cup. And as she did, she could feel Jake's eyes still on her. Watching. Waiting. And suddenly, the house didn't feel like hers anymore. The hours passed in a strange, uncomfortable blur. Elena tried to go about her usual routine, reading a book, scrolling through her phone, catching up on housework. But no matter what she did, she couldn't shake the awareness that Jake was still in the house. She could hear him moving from room to room. Sometimes, she'd catch a glimpse of him in the hallway or sitting on the couch, flipping through channels without really watching. But what unsettled her the most was his silence. He wasn't his usual quiet self. This was different. This was intentional. By the time evening rolled around, Elena had decided to avoid him altogether. She stayed in her room longer than usual, pretending to be busy. But the feeling of being watched never really left her. As the sun set, she finally forced herself out of her room to grab a glass of water. She moved quickly, her feet nearly silent against the hardwood floor. As she reached the kitchen, she flicked on the light, letting out a slow breath. Just get your water and go back. Don't overthink it. She reached for a glass, filled it at the sink, and took a sip. And then a shadow moved in the reflection of the window. Her body went rigid. Slowly, she turned. Jake was standing in the doorway. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there, watching her. Elena's pulse spiked, but she forced herself to stay calm. Hey, she said, her voice carefully even. Jake didn't respond right away. Then, after a long moment, he took a step forward. You're avoiding me. Elena's grip tightened on the glass. No, You are. Jake cut her off, his voice quieter now. There was something in his tone, something that sent a chill down her spine. Elena exhaled through her nose, forcing a small, casual laugh. Jake, I'm not avoiding you. I've just been busy. Jake took another step closer. Her instincts screamed at her to move. Run. But she held her ground, her heart pounding. You don't have to be afraid of me, Jake said suddenly. Elena froze. The way he said it, soft, almost gentle, felt worse than if he had shouted it. Like he knew she was afraid. Like he was enjoying it. She swallowed hard, setting the glass down. I'm not afraid of you, Jake. He tilted his head slightly. Are you sure? A lump formed in her throat. For the first time since he had come to stay with them, she felt genuinely unsafe. Elena forced herself to step back toward the hallway, keeping her movements slow and natural. It's late, she said. I think I'm going to bed. Jake watched her for a moment longer. Then, finally, he nodded. Yeah, me too. She turned and walked away, keeping her breathing steady. She didn't dare look back. But even as she reached her bedroom and locked the door behind her, she could still feel it. Jake's gaze, pressing against her, through the walls, through the dark. waiting, watching. And for the first time, Elena truly believed she wasn't safe in her own home. Elena lay in bed, her body stiff beneath the covers. The room was dark, but sleep felt impossible. Her heart was still racing from her encounter with Jake in the kitchen. "You don't have to be afraid of me." Those words wouldn't leave her head. She told herself she was overreacting, that she was being paranoid, but her instincts screamed otherwise. Somewhere down the hall, a floorboard creaked. Elena's breath caught in her throat. It was late. Too late for anyone to still be awake. Her mind raced. Maybe Jake was just getting a drink of water. Maybe he had gone to the bathroom. But deep down, she knew better. She reached for her phone on the nightstand, her fingers hovering over the screen. Should she call Mark? Or would that make things worse? Another creak. Closer this time. Elena held her breath, her eyes locked on the door. The silence stretched. Then, the doorknob rattled. A cold wave of terror crashed over her. She had locked the door. She was sure of it. But the knob twisted again. A second later, a soft knock. Elena's pulse pounded so hard she thought her ribs might crack. "Elena." Jake's voice, software controlled. She didn't answer. The doorknob twisted again, harder this time. "Elena," Jake repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "Are you awake?" She didn't move, didn't breathe. The silence between them stretched unbearably long. Then, the knob stilled. A long pause. Footsteps. Fading. Elena didn't move until she heard the distant sound of a door closing down the hall. Even then, she stayed frozen for a long time, gripping her phone so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her breath came in shallow bursts, her mind racing. That wasn't normal. That wasn't okay. Jake had tried to get into her room. And the worst part? She had no idea what he would have done if the door hadn't been locked. Elena squeezed her eyes shut, her hands trembling. She needed to get out of this house. And soon. Because now, she wasn't just uneasy. She wasn't just suspicious. She was afraid. Truly, deeply afraid. Elena didn't sleep. She lay in bed, every muscle stiff, ears straining for any sound in the dark. The house felt too quiet, like it was holding its breath, waiting. Waiting for Jake to try again. Her mind raced with possibilities. She could call Mark, but what would she even say? "Your nephew is creeping me out" didn't seem like enough. She could call the police, but Jake hadn't actually done anything. Yet. That word twisted in her gut. By the time dawn's pale light bled through her curtains, Elena had made her decision. She needed to leave. At least for the day. Just enough time to clear her head, to figure out what to do next. She forced herself to get up, moving quietly as she grabbed her bag and slipped on a sweater. Her phone was already in her pocket, ready in case she needed it. As she cracked her door open, she hesitated, listening. Silence. Her stomach twisted. The hallway was empty, the house still. She stepped out, moving quickly toward the front door. She almost made it. Almost. But as she reached for the doorknob, Elena. Her body jolted. She turned slowly. Jake stood at the end of the hallway, half hidden in the dim morning light. She forced a shaky smile. "Morning." He didn't smile back. "Where are you going?" he asked. Elena's grip on her bag tightened. "Just stepping out for a bit, running some errands." Jake tilted his head slightly. For a long, unbearable moment, he just looked at her. Then, too casually, he asked, "Do you want me to come with you?" Her stomach twisted. Number absolutely not. She forced a laugh. "That's okay. I won't be long." Another pause. Then finally Jake nodded. But he didn't move. Didn't turn away. Didn't stop watching her. Elena swallowed hard, gripping the doorknob like a lifeline. See you later, she murmured, forcing herself to move. She stepped outside, pulling the door shut behind her. Only when she was safely in her car, engine running, did she finally allow herself to breathe. Her hands were shaking. She pulled out of the driveway, heart hammering, gut screaming at her. She didn't know where she was going. She only knew one thing. She couldn't go back.